And then now when we're ready to get started, I'll again have to mute my microphone, which will take the control away from you, but you'll be all set once you can just click back on the screen.
Okay. And I'll probably take a bio break about halfway through or so, I'm thinking.
Yeah, great idea. Great idea. Let me just look at all the participants here. We have 17 who should be joining us. So nearly everybody's here. And everyone can hear us now. So welcome out there, everyone. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. It is a lovely day wherever you are in the country. All right, I am showing about 30 seconds on my end. So just hold on and give anyone else a chance to join in that will. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I will just welcome everyone to our Good Auditing Practices short course. The course is offered in 3 sessions. We have today from 11 until 1:30 approximately. We'll take a break tomorrow. We will reconvene Wednesday and Thursday at the same time. Of course, in your email, you saw that each day has a unique login. So on Wednesday, you'll want to use Wednesdays, and I will send out Wednesday and Thursday morning the login just for confirmation. So it's easy to find, and we'll see everybody in 3 parts. I'll just read a brief introduction on EAS Consulting Group and your instructor today, Bob Fish. First, EAS is a member of the Certified Family of Companies, and we are a leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA. Our global network of over 150 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive training, auditing, consulting services, and we help to ensure proactive regulatory compliance. So from regulatory strategy development, compliance assistance, preparation of technical submissions, such as drug master files, 510Ks, new dietary ingredients, as well as offering support for receipt of FDA Form 483s and warning letter mediations. We also help companies prepare for FDA audits and inspections. And through our comprehensive solution of services, we're able to provide the detailed knowledge and experience that your company requires to ensure your proactive, accurate, and timely assistance. So just a little bit about your presenter today, Bob. Bob Fish has been with EAS since 2006 and has consulted for FDA regulated industries for 24 years. Prior to consulting, he spent 33 years with FDA, the last 6 of which he served as the director of the Division of Field Investigations, where he is responsible for general policy and guidance for the agency's domestic and international investigation activities. He also managed foreign inspection operations. Prior to that position, Bob was the Director of Compliance at the Nashville District Office and was a supervisory investigator. And Mr. Fish is experienced in all aspects of FDA regulated products. He has expertise in compliance matters such as GMPs as they relate to pharmaceuticals, supplements, devices, and biologics. He is ISO 9000 lead assessor trained and an AFTO certified HACCP instructor. He's also, of course, a sought after expert speaking at international events on FDA inspections and GMPs, and he is one of EAS's most popular trainers. So you are in for a treat these next 3 days. I'll just mention as well regarding questions, of course, everyone currently is muted or should be muted. If you would not remind staying muted until we get to breaks where we can ask questions. If you click on the participant panel, you'll see the ability to raise your hand. And if you do have any questions, if you'll just hold them until our various question opportunities so that we can try to get them all in by section. And of course, if you think in the future of something you wish you'd asked previously, you're more than welcome to ask a question at any time. Just raise your hand and we'll be glad to call on you when the time comes. So with that, Bob, let me mute my microphone briefly. Then you should be able to click on the screen and take it away. Okay, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, I should be able to control the slides now.
Yes, you should. When I mute my mic back, you should be able to click on the slide screen and that will put you back in control.
Okay, here we go. Looks like we got everything. Looks like we got everything working here. Get back here to the beginning. Good morning, everybody. And again, my name is Bob Fish. Amy just gave me the very glowing summary of my background. All I can say is at this point in time, I've been around for a long time and have gotten to be a fairly old man with 6 grandkids and have seen the world thanks to ES and FDA. At any rate, I'm looking forward to getting through these 3 days. Each day we will have a list or an agenda for each day. We'll look at that in just a moment. But also, we are programmed this for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours each session. To tell you the honest truth, I don't know exactly how long it will take. I don't think it'll take longer than that, but of course it will depend upon how many questions that you all have as we go through these sections. I'll also plan to take a bio break approximately halfway through or so, you know, we can get up and stretch and do whatever's necessary for a few minutes. So with that, let's just get on into this presentation. We're looking first for today. These are the general topics that we're going to be discussing today: the GMP overview, good auditing practice, facility tour, auditing documents and records, and then finally wrapping it up with some discussion of personnel training and hygiene issues. Similarly, for Wednesday and Thursday, we have agendas the same way. We'll wait until Wednesday and Thursday when we talk about them in more detail. And finally, we'll finish it up with the last one. So just what do I want to accomplish here today on this training? Well, we want to begin by thinking of providing you a general overview of GMP concepts, you know, and how to prepare, manage, and conduct a GMP audit. Now, this audit, you can do audits, of course, for a lot of different purposes, but this particular course is designed to address GMP type auditing. And for reference, we'll basically use the drug and the dietary supplement GMPs as sort of a guide as just what you might be using when you go into one of these audits. So these audit techniques, again, are directed towards conducting GMP audits. So we're going to try to train you on overall good auditing practices, and now we hopefully succeed. Provide some insights on how to conduct an effective facility tour, a few tips and things we've learned over the years about what works and what doesn't work so well for facility tours. And then we're going to train you on effective ways to audit documents and records. Train you on how to audit each of the quality systems and the requirements. As we go through the GMPs, we're not necessarily going through them point by point in this session, but for those of you that are familiar with the drug and the dietary supplement GMPs, there's a variety of different quality systems that are discussed. And so we're going to, in this course, discuss auditing those various quality systems. And then we're going to provide you with recommendations on how to write an audit report and discuss a little bit about effective follow-up. So FDA requires that all manufacturers must establish and follow quality systems. Now that comes from all of the regulated areas, and again, particularly focusing on drug and dietary supplements. That it says right up front that you must have a quality system, and you must design a quality system that meets the requirement of that particular GMP, whatever it is. Quality systems for most FDA regulated products, again, foods, drugs, biologics, are known as current good manufacturing practices, or little c GMPs. Now let's just mention a minute the little c. Where that comes from is we have the written documents, the good manufacturing practices, the GMPs. But the FDA expectation is a continually rising bar. That is, we can read the words in that GMP and we can see it says to do specific things, but FDA interprets the GMPs through this concept of little c, current. What is the current practice in the industry concerning a particular GMP concept? So it's not good enough just to read the words in the GMP. You must also stay abreast with what the industry is doing, what FDA is doing in terms of enforcement of GMPs. And we do that by watching presentations made by FDA people, by warning letters and 483s that are issued. That gives us some insight as to what the FDA thinking is concerning their interpretation of a particular section of the GMPs. Now, the last bullet I think is important to remember is the FDA and GMPs do not prescribe how to be compliant, but only details what is required to be compliant. And I think that's beneficial for the industry because you have the leeway of deciding how you're going to comply with a particular section of that regulation. They don't prescribe the exact procedure, the exact detail as to how you need to comply. They give you the general concept, and then you have to design a system that works for you. And again, I think that's to your advantage because that gives you the leeway to design a system that fits into just how do you do business in your particular company. Now, when we think about quality and management, there are some very important things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, management support is critical. If you do not have management support and a company philosophy of compliance, it's going to be very difficult to ever have an effective quality system. Now, I and EAS people do a lot of audits, and it's not uncommon when we're doing an audit that it's very apparent to us that the company's just going through the motions. They really don't have any quality philosophy. They're just trying to escape being in trouble with the FDA. A quality system should add value to your operation. GMPs are good management practices, we believe, as well as the regulation. So we have to make sure we're instilling in the philosophy of the company and all staff that quality is very, very important, and it's more than just a concept, a regulatory requirement. So it certainly starts with management support, management commitment, okay? And then, of course, we have to have a robust quality system, and we'll talk a little more about what we're looking for in that regard. And we must enforce a commitment to quality throughout the entire organization. Every person in an organization can have some impact, good or bad, on compliance with the GMP requirements. So it starts from bottom to the top. Everyone must be committed and everyone must be aware of what the quality requirements are. And quality decisions must supersede business needs. When we do our audits, we always look at the organizational structure because FDA expects that the quality group, the people making the decisions about releasing materials and releasing finished product, must have an independent reporting structure from the production. It's not acceptable for quality to report into the production manager, although we have seen that occasion. Certainly, we have an immediate conflict of interest. So the quality decisions must be totally separate from any business decisions associated with it. Certainly, there's always costs involved. If we have to decide, quality has to decide a particular batch of product cannot be released. That has a cost factor associated with it. But we must make every effort we can to separate the business decisions from the quality decisions. And then, of course, the quality and the company is expected to ensure that only acceptable products are released for distribution and sale. If we find something wrong with a product, it doesn't meet all of the specifications established for that product, it's not acceptable to release that product for sale. Maybe we can recondition it, rework it, or some way bring it into acceptable criteria, acceptable specifications. But if we can't, it cannot and should not be released for sale. So then once it's determined that a defective product warrants a market withdrawal or recall, there should be no hesitation to remove the defective product. That's a business decision. It's also a liability risk decision on the part of the company. So FDA expects if you have a product that is not in compliance with the regulations and the law, that you will in fact retrieve it from the market, and usually that's done through market withdrawals or recalls. So let's just review a little bit more about some of the keys to the successful quality compliance program. Management commitment and support, as I already mentioned. Certainly, we must have qualified and committed employees throughout the organization. Qualified and trained employees, of course. And a quality unit with responsibility and authority. Again, making sure that the quality unit has the necessary authority to make those difficult decisions about releasing or not releasing product for sale. Must be thorough documentation, as we'll talk about repeatedly during this course. If something wasn't documented, in FDA's eyes, it's just a rumor that it was ever done. So GMP compliance is all about documentation, documentation, documentation. Then, of course, we must have appropriate processes and systems. As we look at the various aspects of the quality system, there are certain systems and procedures that we just must have in place. Usually those look like something like work instructions or SOPs or a combination thereof in order to have an appropriate system that will work. And they must be detailed procedures. We'll talk a little more about how procedures should be constructed and written and what it should contain. And of course, adequate training. I do not believe that staff intentionally make mistakes, but as we do our audits, it very often becomes apparent that people did not do things correctly because they were not adequately trained. So certainly training is of utmost importance. Then there's going to be a need for in-process controls. Of course, specifications throughout the process. I mean, we start with specifications for materials. We may have in-process specifications and controls, and finally, we're always going to have a finished product specification. And it's our obligation to make sure that every product that we release for sale, when it's released, has met all of those established specifications. And of course, we're always going to be testing and evaluating materials and products to ensure that all of those specifications were in fact met. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide point by point because we're going to be talking about most of these areas as we go through the rest of this presentation. But this is just an example of some of the subparts or sections, if you will, of a typical GMP. If we looked at the drug GMP, we look at the dietary supplement GMP, again, we're going to find these particular topics in those two documents. So let's hit on personnel for a minute. Certainly, each company will need personnel to have appropriate training and experience and authority, okay, to comply with the GMPs. This is going to be in every quality system that we look at. We must have appropriately trained personnel. We must decide what kind of training that they need, and we must provide them that identified training. Personnel, of course, also have to use appropriate sanitary practices and follow procedures to prevent contamination of the product. Again, depending on the nature of the product, Mostly we're talking about microbiological contamination, but we also could be talking about filth or other things. So from a micro standpoint, depends on the nature of the product. Some products that are produced, drugs and dietary supplements, certainly are not subject to microcontamination at all. And basically, they just will not even support microbial growth. So there we have a little easier task. Whereas other products, particularly liquid products, often are very subject to microcontamination. So we're going to have to make an awful lot of effort into sanitary and control procedures. If we're making a sterile drug product or even a dietary supplement, I have seen a couple of companies that make sterile dietary supplement products, then the whole environmental sanitation practice thing ratchets up a whole lot. As most of you would know, then we're going to get into controlled environments and things like that to make sure we have the appropriate environment for producing this sterile or low micro level product. And document controls. You must have thorough procedures and documentation that quality personnel are responsible for managing and maintaining. And you must have a formal document control system. So all of these written procedures or documents that are going to be required for compliance with these GMPs, the SOPs, the work procedures, the specification, and the list just goes on and on and on. They are all considered what we call controlled documents. That is, once we get a document in place that complies with the requirements, we can't just willy-nilly be making changes in those documents as we wish. So we must have a document control procedure such that documents are originally prepared by the appropriate people. They're reviewed and approved, and the final documents are always approved by the quality unit. And then they're distributed to whoever needs them. In today's world, it's probably just electronic, although there are instances where hard copy documents are still distributed. So then if we have a need to change any of those documents, we must make sure that we appropriately review any changes. And again, that document is reviewed and approved by whoever the subject matter experts are, but finally by the quality group before it's released for use. And then in every operation, there's going to be manufacturing and process controls that'll be necessary. So basically, all of the GMPs say you must have appropriate specifications for incoming materials, in-process materials, and finished products. Whatever the product is, whether it's a drug or a dietary supplement, or we could even talk about devices in the same token, you must have specifications to make sure that you input materials that meet all established specs and that the finished product that we release for sale meets whatever established specifications we have for that. So this is verified through a variety of documentation practices. Certainly, we'll have detailed testing methods, scientifically valid or valid testing methods for the raw materials and the finished product. And we'll also have manufacturing and packaging batch records and master records, as well as the batch records themselves. And again, a variety of SOPs surrounding how we do the processes. And then, of course, we're always going to have some nonconformances along the way. So we must have procedures to do evaluation and acceptance or rejection of nonconforming materials. So we must ensure incoming materials and ingredients for finished tobacco products, for dietary supplements, for drugs, in fact, meet all specifications that we've established. And if not, we have a quality procedure to investigate the failure and perform appropriate disposition and corrective action. They may be deviations, they may be non-conformance investigations. Those investigations take on a number of different terms. But in some way, if we have materials that did not meet all of our specifications, We must investigate, evaluate, and make a scientifically sound decision about what happened with them, why they are not acceptable. And of course, depending on the findings, we may well have to get into corrective actions, CAPAs, corrective and preventive actions. Records, records, records. I mentioned earlier on, GMP documentation is all about, compliance is all about documentation, documentation. Says you must have procedures and supporting documentations for all GMP related activities. When we read the drug or the dietary supplement GMPs, in a lot of places it says you must have a written procedure for whatever the activity is. Well, that'll be a group of procedures that we'll have to have, but everybody knows that are in the business that there's a lot more procedures than just those that are specifically called out in the regulation. That will be necessary to have a compliance system. Again, I emphasize again, if it was not documented, then we cannot prove that it was done. And as I said, FDA says if it wasn't documented, it's just a rumor that the activity was even ever done. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit then about what is an audit. Well, the first bullet here is you probably could go to Webster Dictionary and find this definition, suggesting it's a methodical and independent examination of a system or selected system elements to determine compliance with a specified standard or standards. So if we're doing a drug GMP audit, we're examining that system to determine if it complies with the requirements of the drug GMP, the 21 CFR Part 211. Further, we suggest that an audit is a documented activity conducted in accordance with written procedures. We're going to talk about later, we're definitely going to have a plan for conducting the audit so we know where we're going next, what we're looking for, and so on and so forth. The next bullet suggests an evaluation of objective evidence to determine if the system was effectively implemented. So what we are doing then in this audit, we're looking at written procedures, making sure that the written procedures are adequate in detail to comply with the GMPs. And then we're also looking at executed documents that were produced under that procedure to make sure that they complied with the requirements of that written procedure, the SOP, work instruction, whatever the procedure was. And then finally, an audit is an opportunity to identify weaknesses warranting improvement or corrective action. So who makes these audits? Well, there's a variety of government agencies. The one that comes to mind to most of us first is FDA, but there are also a lot of state and local agencies that make audits as well of both the drug and dietary supplement. There are a variety of accreditation bodies. I'm just looking here, for instance, at ISO, but in the drug and dietary supplement industry, there are a number of other accreditation offer operations or bodies that will make these kind of audits and give you maybe a certificate of compliance with whatever the standard is they were auditing against. Then, of course, there are external auditors. If you are in a contract manufacturing business, you know that you get a lot of visits from the people you make products for. They will want to come on site and review your quality system, make sure if you're making a dietary supplement for them, that you're complying with all of the dietary supplement GMPs, 21 CFR Part 111. So we have those kind of audits as well. You will have internal or self-inspection audits under all of these GMP programs. It is an FDA expectation that you will be doing internal or self audits yourself, just because you have an obligation to be monitoring your operation to make sure that in fact that you are in fact complying with whatever you set up as far as the GMP requirements, practices, procedures, whatever systems you have in place. You're expected to do your own internal auditing to determine if in fact you're complying. There's also a group of audits we call mock inspections. And in fact, we in EIS do mock inspections for a company pretty often. And what we do is we go through this audit much like as if it was an FDA inspection. We look at the operation from GMP compliance standpoint, but we're also, beyond making sure that the system is adequate, we're looking at staff procedures, staff performance. Are staff able to appropriately locate documents when they're requested? Are staff able to give appropriate answers to questions as we go through them? And again, we'll be performing that audit against a particular regulatory standard. That is, if it's a drug or dietary supplement. And we're attempting to do that mock audit, as I said, or mock inspection, much like as if it was a real FDA inspection. Now, for some of us in EAS, myself included, that's easy because that's the way we know how to make audits or make inspections, the way we were trained in FDA to do them. So we carry that over then going on into clients. Now, however, some companies, and most companies should and do, conduct their own mock inspections as well. Maybe it's just part of their routine internal auditing activity, but they do them much like as if it was a real regulatory inspection. Then there are other audit types. We call them gap analysis types. Again, we're auditing against a particular standard, whether it's the dietary supplement or the dietary supplement or the drug GMP. We do those as well when companies ask us to do an audit of their operation. Many times we characterize those as gap analysis. Basically, again, we're looking at their quality system against the audit standard, the drug or dietary supplement GMP requirements, and we're looking to see are in fact they complying with all the requirements of those regulations, or are there gaps that need to be addressed as a result of that audit. Now, what are we looking for in an effective audit? Certainly, in addition to the combination of education, training, and experience, a good auditor has to have some of the following attributes we believe. Certainly detail-oriented. The proof is in the detail, as we talk about it a lot. When we look at a procedure, is it in fact covering all the details that are required in the drug GMP, the dietary supplement GMP? And certainly I think an auditor has to be a good listener. As I've experienced this over many years, I like to just ask a question, and then I like to just be quiet and listen. And people being audited just have to fill up that void of silence. And so people will start talking, and you'd be amazed at what they might say when they start really sharing their inner feelings about what's going on in the company. So you need to be a good listener when you go into these audits. Don't do all the talking yourself. Give the auditee plenty of time to respond, because you might be surprised about some of the responses you might hear. And then auditors need to be open-minded and flexible. You know, there isn't necessarily just one right way to do an audit, depending on the type of operation, the people that you're dealing with. Certainly, you need to be flexible, and sometimes in terms of time and availability of people, you can't demand tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I must see the quality director. No, they have a busy schedule too, so we have to work around those production and management responsibilities as well. Certainly being a good communicator, interpersonal skills help. You know, certainly some people are more difficult to get along with than others. So you have to be aware of that and do the best you can. Certainly you don't want to get into big arguments with the people, because that doesn't get you anywhere. Able to read people and situations. When I was in FDA, I was given a lot of training on auditing and really what we might even call interrogation. Watch people, watch their reactions. For instance, one of the things I was trained on in the early days was the idea that people's reaction tell you a lot about them. For instance, I don't know if it's always true, but we were told that if a person is answering your question and is lying to you, in all likelihood, most people cannot look you in the eye and give you that answer. That's just one simple little example of being able to read people. But you know what I find these days with COVID, we're doing some virtual audits, and I'm really missing the opportunity to have face-to-face sit downs with people, because I think there's a big part of auditing that can help you understand or at least make some general conclusions just about what's going on with the people. So think about how people are reacting to your questions and so on. And then, you know, maybe make sure, not necessarily scientific conclusions, but if you get a feeling that people are not being honest with you in their answers to audit questions, then you have a challenge. So certainly there, we think, are some basic principles of auditing to maintain a high level of integrity as well. Ethical conduct for sure, you know, fair presentation. Don't make your presentation one-sided or focused more on one issue than another. Professional, independent objectivity. Impartial, certainly. Evaluate based on evidence. Yes, when it comes down to it, we have to have evidence that there is compliance or non-compliance with these particular requirements. And that evidence is in terms of documents, documentation. Again, it continues to come back. Documentation, documentation, documentation is what it's all about. And then auditors need to be competent. Certainly they need experience and education to be able to do it. You need to be cooperative, again, as I said, and you need to build up a trust with these people early on, because it certainly will help as you go farther into these audits. Now, I mentioned internal audit program, and certainly the scope of each audit conducted as part of the program can be varied. Again, you can have what we would call a comprehensive audit, and we do that in our audits as well, and even FDA does that, where we're going to look at all the systems involved, or focused, targeting potential problem areas. Again, if a company wants us just to look at their investigations, their out of specification areas, or whatever it might be, we can target it on just particular areas. And certainly for your internal auditing, you're going to want to rotate into different departments. And what we find in most internal audit programs is they have a basic program, and then they have probably an annual schedule, and each quarter they may look at a different department within their operation so that they make sure they cover all departments through the course of the year. So certainly there are some benefits to internal audit teams and programs. Remembering again, it's not necessarily something you could decide to do. It's something you need to do because FDA expects that you will have an internal audit program. But if we have our own internal audit team, certainly can perform efficient and effective audits. They know the system. Maybe you could argue they know the system too well, whereas if we come in from outside, we don't know the system, but there's some advantages to both approaches, we're pretty sure. So certainly it can improve and enhance the relationship with the auditees. You might have some good team building activities even as a result of these internal auditing activities. Manage and reduce business and product risks. Certainly the business risk with FDA citing you for not doing it is important. You can identify the issues with the most risk and focus on their resolution. So you will have audit observations, which you'll classify as critical, major, minor, which will give you a lot of guidance as to which ones you're going to focus most efforts on. So let's talk just a minute then about managing an audit program. Certainly, first, an audit program must be planned and implemented. That is, for your internal audit program, you're going to have an SOP that describes how the internal audit program is going to be conducted and managed. And then you're going to designate responsibility for an audit coordinator that will be required to maintain the audit schedule, determine audit types and standard, assign the appropriate auditors, initiate the audits, manage audit reports, and oversee necessary CAPAs from audits. Typically, if we find deficiencies during these internal audits, there needs to be follow-up, and often those follow-ups are handled in terms of CAPAs. So just a little bit more on audit scheduling, okay? So as I suggested, tentative audit plans should be made at least annually, okay? And they might be for cause, they might be just general, whatever the consideration might be, depending on what your last audit results were, you may well be going into a for cause. And you're going to assign time for these audits, again, depending on what the issue is or what kind of audit it is. We suggest for a formal audit, it may be 1 to 5 days. EAS usually likes to have 3 to 4 days at least. We might can do quite a bit in 2 days. But again, depending on the nature of the audit, you're going to decide how much time you're going to assign for that audit. And then you need to monitor and know when the audit plans are not being met. That is definitely a management oversight responsibility to make sure that you write a plan and that you are accomplishing that plan, or there's good excuses why you have not. Certainly, every time we do an audit, we're going to have an audit plan. Again, in EAS, when we do audits for companies, we always have a written plan. We share that plan with the company before we even start the audit, give them an opportunity to tweak it if they want to. So then that plan is also going to identify what the standard requirement is going to be. Is it going to be the drug GMPs, dietary supplement GMP? What is the basic audit standard going to be? Okay. And then, of course, you must be prepared to adjust the plan based on the company activities or the audit findings. When I go into an audit with an audit plan, it never works out exactly as I planned it. Depending on what I find in day one, we may have to move a lot of things from day one to day two, or vice versa. You know, again, you must be flexible and able to adjust as you go through this. And then you always conduct a tour of all areas get an overview of what's going on in the facility. And we're going to talk a bit later about conducting that tour. Plan on spending majority of the audit reviewing documents, procedures, and data. Audits have always been about document review. And certainly now for us in EAS doing virtual audits, it's almost entirely document review. That's an important part of it, but I still say that we're missing a whole lot by not being able to physically see the facility, sit face to face with people, and try to read how they're reacting to our questions and comments. So we're going to have this audit agenda, okay? And in that agenda, we're going to talk about a few things suggested on this slide. Certainly, we're going to have introductions. We like to have a presentation from the company about an overview of what goes on in that company. Basically, things like how do they manufacture product, what product do they manufacture, floor plans, list of SOPs and things like that we list here below in the initial documents that we will request. And we also make it clear that what the audit standard is going to be as we get into this opening meeting. We suggest this be maybe not more than 30 or 45 minutes, but it's very helpful for an auditor who's never seen the facility before to have an overview of just what's going on in the facility. And it gives you an opportunity to explain to the auditor what you do and kind of how you do it. So as I suggested, certainly the major part of most all audits is an extensive record review process, okay? So items or operations observed to be lacking or concern during the facility tour. So we could do this tour. We find out there, maybe there's additional documents or areas we need to look into that we didn't necessarily identify in our audit plans. We may need to address that. Traceability evaluations, materials and products is extremely important. We have to be able to trace everything that comes into the facility, what we did with it, what products it went into, as well as the finished product, of course. And then, of course, we're going to be making this direct comparison of the standard required, the GMP requirements, against the documents that we actually see and review. So just a few wrap-up observation thoughts here. We're going to make observations to regulatory and standard requirements, but we must document them. The auditor must document in order to thoroughly report the details in that audit report. We can't just say we observed failure to comply with section 211, whatever. We must show examples of how that non-compliance was in fact observed in documents. So we must provide sufficient detail in your documentation system to explain all observations found. So again, we're going to provide supporting examples of references, documents, SOPs, or executed documents where there was non-compliance with the GMP requirements. And it goes without saying that all observations must be factual. Do not speculate. Just the evidence, folks, just the evidence. We must point out observations found to the auditee and allow them to comment to ensure accuracy. So when I finish an audit, I discuss with the auditee the observations that I made, and they have an opportunity at that point to correct me or add additional information in case I misunderstanding. When I finish an audit, I want to make sure that I'm leaving with the right understanding. And then again, we will discuss corrective and preventive actions as appropriate. Now, for us in EAS, we're not necessarily expecting a response from you folks at the time we do the audit, but FDA does expect such responses as well. So just a few auditor tips here that we think about along the way. Do inner memory checks during the audit. Consult your agenda. I look at my agenda a lot when I'm making the audit just to make sure that I didn't miss something. Okay. Determine what essential items still require attention on a frequent basis. And remember that the audit is just a snapshot. You cannot see everything. At some point, the audit has to be over and you must stop. And the audit is never done. It just runs out of time. And that's what I like to keep in mind always, is that when you're in the middle of an audit, you often think, oh gosh, I wish I had another day. I wish I had a few more hours. No, basically, the company or we committed to a certain amount of time. When that time is up, the audit is over. Okay, so let's move on then to the facility tour. As I suggested, that's one of the things I think we're missing a lot in doing these virtual audits, and I think it's very, very important. So when we go out there, we observe what's going on. We talk to people. We just ask them, tell me, how are things going in this area? Do you ever have any problems with this equipment? And people are very proud of what they do. And it's amazing to me when you ask an open-ended question like, do you ever have any problems with this equipment? Surprise me in real life situations, how much people will share with me. For instance, I've had situations where it said, and I plead ignorance. I see a big old piece of manufacturing equipment. I kind of understand what it does, but not totally. So I'll ask the operator, do you ever have any problem with this equipment? And this is some real life war stories. Well, most of the time not, but you should have been here last week. You know, the bottom fell out of this thing and we had product all over the floor. Believe it or not, that's a real story. So listen to people, have them show you, tell you, and you might be quite surprised at what you'll learn as you go through the through that discussion with them. Certainly, you've got to review documents that are in the area when we're doing this walkthrough. That is, there should be a copy of the batch record, or somewhere the batch record should be available for people to follow. Work instructions, SOPs that are necessary to do the work, they need to be available there as you go through, and you're going to ask for those. Okay. As I've emphasized, I certainly think that the facility tour is a very critical part of any audit. Okay. So we recommend that you just follow the process. That is, you start where materials are received and just follow the production or process flow through the manufacturing all the way through distribution and finished product. Ask questions along the way, see what you see. You may be surprised, maybe you'll be spick and span clean, okay? Make sure you get into the laboratories, the storage areas. Restrooms, certainly restrooms are required to be available. Where are they? Are they clean? Things like that. And then when you think you're done, ask the operators, now, is there anything I missed? Did I miss some part of the facility? Just verify that, in fact, you saw all the critical, important parts of the operation. And then we recommend that the entire audit team, now, from the standpoint of auditors, sometimes it's one, more often it may be a team of a couple of people, but from the company, it might be several people involved. Now, I say the entire team with the caveat that sometimes those teams can get so large, they can be 10, 12 or more people, and it's difficult to make an effective tour when you have that many people. So within reason, I'd like to have the entire audit team involved in that facility tour. But again, depending on the situation and the number, you might have to verify or alter that a little bit. So in the manufacturing operations, we're trying to ensure that they have established and follow procedures as appropriate. So we're looking for things like the batch record, work instructions, cleaning procedures and things like that operators would need out there on the floor in the facilities. So we're looking for that. And we're just observing, is it clean and does it look like it's maintained sanitary and clean as we walk around through there. There will be a variety of different logs out there with the equipment, maintenance logs, cleaning logs. We're always going to pick up and look at some of those, make sure they're current, okay? Just make sure that things seem to be properly labeled. If there are quarantine areas, are the quarantine areas identified, or are they roped off such that we are protecting quarantine material from accidentally being moved into unacceptable or to acceptable product? If there's a reject or on hold area, I always want to see that. I want to make sure that it's secured. If we have products that are on hold or rejected, we already have determined that there's probably something wrong with them. So I want to look at products there, see that they're clearly identified, that they are on hold or rejected, and maybe even some supporting documentation to tell me why they are in fact rejected or on hold. When we get into the packaging labeling area, we're looking for the conditions and segregation of packaging components and label holding areas. Do we have reasonable separation of these areas, one from the other, to help prevent cross-contamination of labels or product from one area to another? Are there barriers? Certainly, some of the GMP requirements talk about spatial separation of activities. How close are the packaging labeling lines to one to another? Are they so close you can hardly walk between them? I have a general audit standard that within AES has kind of become known as the Bob Fish standard. When I walk into a packaging labeling area, I suggest if I can reach out my two arms, and if I can touch a line on each side with my arms, I think that's probably too close. Spatial separation certainly is very helpful in help minimizing potential cross-contamination. Barriers between lines is even better. So that's some of the kind of things you're looking for as you're going out through this facility tour. And then are there other documents out there associated with in-process inspections? Certainly when we talk about producing tablets. There will be things like tablet weights being done, maybe tablet hardness, whatever in-process quality checks are necessary and being done. There's an opportunity to see them right out there on the line. Make sure that those documents are being filled out at the time they're doing the work so that they're being maintained current. And usually we have quality staff out there looking at these documents, reviewing them as well. So if we're completing the tour, we're going to be taking a lot of notes. We're going to make sure that we get all of our questions answered out there. Now, I will initially do a facility tour when I start an audit, but many times I may have need or interest in going back to verify certain things in some areas, so I may go back again. But typically, I do a facility tour one time, and that's probably the end of it, okay? Now, we want to also make sure that as we go through this facility tour, if we ask for documents that should be there, like SOPs for cleaning equipment and so on and so forth, they should be able to produce them right there on the spot, because those operators need to have access to those procedures. So it's a good test to see and test if they are in fact available as is expected and required. And as I suggested, do not hesitate to go back out on the floor during the audit if there's needs. I sometimes do that, not always, but depending on what I see the first time, and as I go farther into the audit, there may be things come up that raise questions in my mind that will cause me to want to go back. Okay, I think we'll go through this next section and then we will probably take a short bio break and some questions, okay? Next area we're going to talk about then is records and documents. As I've already suggested repeatedly, all the GMPs dictate that a company must establish and follow written procedures. Again, both in the drug and the dietary supplement GMPs, there are a number of places where it said you must have written procedures. So as a starting point, we can do a kind of a checklist of all of those specific requirements and make sure that the company has written procedures for all areas. But again, as I suggested, there are a lot of other activities that company will have to have procedures for that are not necessarily specifically identified in the regulations. So we want to, first of all, verify that the company does have all the required procedures. Then, of course, above and beyond that, we want to make sure that those procedures meet the requirements of the GMPs, and in fact, the procedures are being followed. So we start kind of a stepwise process, the procedures there, and then we look at executed documents that were produced under that procedure to make sure that, in fact, the procedure is being followed. Because FDA takes the position that if you write a written procedure and you do not follow that procedure, the SOP or otherwise, it is a GMP deficiency just to not have followed your own procedure. So when you write a procedure, you want to make sure, first of all, it meets the requirements of regulation, and make sure it's something that you can do. Is it doable under the way you do business to do things the way you wrote it? So be careful when you write procedures that you don't box yourself into impossible situations. So the next bullet, we suggest that the FDA provides no definition of what constitutes a written procedure. In fact, in the regulations, I do not believe you will find the terminology standard operating procedure. It'll just say written procedures. Now, in practice, that typically takes the form of an SOP, a standard operating procedure, or a work instruction. Again, those are all what we talked about earlier, considered to be controlled documents. Now, talk a little bit about SOPs, and certainly they are probably some of the most critical documents that you have in the company. And why are they? Well, certainly many of them are required by the GMPs, but they also serve as guidance for the company policy. SOPs tend to standardize the system use. If you do things the same way every time and every time according to a written SOP, you will probably get approximately the same results. Whereas if you do something in one way and I do something in another way, we probably aren't going to have consistency in what our results are. It also helps maintain continuity among employees from one group to the next. And of course, it serves as a very good tool for training people on the operation as well. And it certainly reduces confusion and uncertainty. And as I suggest, a very good vehicle for training and instructing employees how to do particular operations. Again, as I mentioned earlier, training is so vitally important, and training on SOP requirements is one of the most important aspects of employee training to make sure they know how to operate equipment, know sure they know how to do a particular analytical test or whatever it calls for in that SOP. Now, SOP is also authorized to define and set controls for all support documents, such as master formulas, master manufacturing records. Again, these are not SOPs per se, but they are written documents that are all considered controlled documents. You can't just willy-nilly change your master formulas or your master manufacturing records. Again, they all have to go through that document preparation and control, review, and approval procedure before they can be put in place or before they can be changed. So there are a variety of other procedures here that are into this category of documents we're talking about, not just as SOPs, but as controlled documents. Now, I list a number of them here on this slide, and this probably is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but we have the master formulas, master manufacturing records, specifications, protocols for various things. We have to qualify equipment. We have to validate the process in the case of drug products. We have to do cleaning validation for drug products, test method, and the list can just go on and on and on as to what would go into that. So when we write an SOP, there's some fairly standard formatting and categories that we need to cover as we prepare that SOP. And as this slide captures most of them, depending on the nature of their SOP, there might be other areas, but we're always going to have a purpose for that SOP. What is the scope of it? What areas, what products does it in fact cover? Who is responsible for writing and approving that SOP? Who is responsible for implementing that SOP? We're typically going to have a definitions section in here. Again, depending on the area, the number of definitions may vary. Might be some issues about safety concerns that we want to emphasize to operators. Certainly, we're going to identify equipment materials that are going to be needed to do this particular activity. And then the procedure itself will basically detail how do you do this particular activity that we're discussing in this procedure. If it's a change request, change control request, we'll detail the steps and how we perform a change control activity. And there may be a variety of attachments. Certainly, with a lot of procedures, there are very beneficial use of forms to document the activity, forms to kind of drive you through the procedure. And I think forms are very good because it will standardize how you do that activity. For instance, if you're doing a batch record review, I can't hardly imagine how you would do that without a form. It tells you specifically what to look for when you go through that batch record review. And then finally, there's the authorization of who prepared it, who prepared and reviewed it, who finally in quality reviewed and approved that procedure. And then, of course, there's expected to be a revision history for that procedure and a little bit of detail as what each revision was associated with. Why did we make that revision? Okay, so again, this is just a little bit more on the content of those various areas, a little more expansion on the purpose, okay? References, we may have reference to other SOPs, we may have reference to a particular section of the GMP that requires that we write this procedure. Again, definitions depending on what's being done here. For instance, if this was an adverse event SOP, we would probably define adverse events, and then we would further define serious adverse events, things like that, whatever's necessary to understand the content of that SOP. Responsibility, again, as I suggested, who is responsible for writing it, revising it, following it, making sure it's monitored. Basically, quality is almost always responsible to make sure that these procedures are being followed. And then in the procedure, whatever detail is necessary to make sure people understand exactly how to do this particular activity, whatever the activity may be. And then we may have appendices, we may have attachments, forms, whatever it is. And finally, as I suggested, we have a revision history. So this is just something that we've all heard, I'm sure, that SOPs should provide thorough and detailed instructions for each step, okay? And we should give it the 5C test. Now, there are a lot of other tests you could come up with, but I think this is still a good place to start when you're looking at an SOP. Is it clear? Is it concise, complete, correct, and compliant? Is it understandable? Is this complete in terms of, does it give us all the details we need to do the job? Is it correct and compliant? That is it in compliance with whatever GMP section we're trying to address? It's often very helpful to incorporate photographs or diagrams, things like that, flow charts, organizational charts, variety of things that can certainly help to understand how the operation is supposed to be conducted and documented. So going back again, SOPs are controlled documents and we must follow them. And what I pointed out a few minutes ago is that FDA suggests, well, they more than suggest, their position is that if you do not follow an SOP as you wrote it, that in itself could be considered a deviation or violation of the GMPs. So again, during the facility tour, we're going to request a lot of these SOPs. We're going to make sure that they're available out there. We're going to make sure to the extent we can out there that they're being followed. And then, of course, as we go into the farther document review, one of the biggest things we're looking for, are there SOPs in place for these areas? Are they compliant? But farther, are they in fact being followed? So we'll have stacks and stacks of executed documents that we're comparing against the requirements of that SOP, just to make sure that, in fact, the company is following as they wrote them. After we've determined that they're in compliance with the regulation, then that next step is verifying that they're being followed. So certainly the inability of personnel to assess SOPs, instruct them how to do the job, is within their job function. If I'm sitting around waiting for 5 or 10 minutes for an operator out on the floor to produce a copy of the SOP they need to know about, I don't think that's very accessible. And so we make those tests, again, out there on the floor, but we also, when we go back to the conference room, we request certain documents and we expect that those documents will be provided in a reasonable amount of time. If I request several SOPs today and I don't get them until noon tomorrow, I'm not convinced that they're very accessible. Either people don't know where they are or their filing system is not very effective. So those are some of the additional checks that we're doing as we go through these auditing activities. Not only are they adequate, but are they available to people in a reasonable amount of time? Because if they can't have the SOP available, how can we expect them to actually follow it? Okay, excuse me. So then just a little mention on the idea of records, okay? So the GMPs dictate that records must be kept as original, true copies, microfiche, or a variety of techniques. Well, in today's world, most SOPs are in some sort of an electronic file. Electronic copies are perfectly fine. However, when we talk about electronic copies of documents and documentation, we can't avoid getting into a discussion of 21 CFR Part 11, electronic records, electronic signatures. And if you're involved with electronic records, as most companies are today, you need to make sure that your documents are in compliance with the Part 11 requirements, particularly from the standpoint of audit trail. Now, you should have done a gap analysis or an evaluation of your system against the Part 11 requirements. Many systems that companies are using are certified by the vendors as being Part 11 compliant, but you yourself should do some checking, testing, make sure that in fact it's compliant with Part 11. And again, one of the main issues we find with most of these electronic records and Part 11 compliance is that area of audit trail. And when I say audit trail, I'm talking about the idea if you enter a document into the system and there are later changes made to that document, is the system able to tell you who made those changes and were they authorized to make those changes? Without that ability of having an audit trail, that system does not have the necessary integrity that is required in order for it to be used as a compliant system for record preparation and record maintenance. So Part 11 compliance is a very significant issue in any and all audits we're doing today with, with the electronic documents if they're stored electronically. Again, just a quick check on the record content. Again, the same thing we talked about with SOPs. We think the 5 C's is a good check on any and all records. Concise, just a little bit more detail about what do we mean by precise, okay? Are they correct, thorough, detailed, yet in a succinct manner? Now, we can go on and on and on and on about detail. I hate to see a SOP that's 20 pages long. I like to see SOP as short as possible, but still provide all the necessary directions that we need. If we have a 25-page SOP, it's my contention that people out there on the facility or anywhere in the facility that have to use that record are unlikely to read that entire document or understand that entire document. So while we have to have a balance between making sure it's correct and concise, we also want to make it as short as we possibly can and still accomplish its purpose. As I mentioned earlier, certainly tables and charts are very helpful if they're needed for, again, documenting something like a batch record review or a complaint investigation. Forms are very, very valuable in putting consistency into how we operate that particular activity. So the next bullet there, do SOPs, forms, and other documents with instructions have simple step-by-step language that can be understood? Again, just a few thoughts about a document being concise. You all could probably come up with a lot of other considerations about just what is concise. This is just a few of our suggestions in that area. Now, is it correct? Were numbers incorrectly transposed when we look at dates in reference to other SOPs? Is everything, all details correct? Okay. So were the correct unit applied to data entries? Like grams versus kilograms. If a procedure, we're talking about 50, but we have no units of measure associated with it, that's meaningless. So we have to look at it from that standpoint of being, I guess, precise as well as correct. Okay. And then there's an area of significant figures we need to think about, particularly and most often when we get into the analytical result determination. What are our significant figures? We probably want a definition of how you determine significant figures. And most of you scientists understand that far better than I do, but you also understand that there is some importance to that idea of what are our significant figures in a particular result. And then calculations. If the calculations today are pretty often done automatically by the analytical equipment, but there's an FDA expectation that at least we do some verification of the actual calculations as well. And decimal points, they can be a bugaboo as well. Are they placed properly and correctly? So it's certainly a very, very important detail that we're looking at from a correct standpoint. Now, from the record access, required records or copies must be made readily available during all the retention time for these documents. And again, that's 2 years, 3 years, depending on the nature of the regulation. But when FDA comes in to make an inspection, they expect you'll be able to provide them access to all of these documents and even copy them. So you need to make sure that your technology permits copying. I'm in the middle of doing one virtual audit right now, for instance, and the company has provided me most of the documents I requested, but I cannot copy them. If this was an FDA inspection, that would not be acceptable. So make sure that you know with your technology, whatever it is, that you not only can provide FDA access, but you can also provide them copies if they ask for that, because they have the legal right to get those. Remember just a little bit more then about forms and the idea that the forms are controlled documents as well. And I've emphasized the point so far that forms are very, very valuable part of a document. But if we revise a procedure, we may have need to revise the form as well. So we make sure we put the forms through the same document change, document control procedure as we did the basic forms. So those documents will have unique document identifiers, revision numbers. So if we change a document, make a revision change, we will change the revision number. Maybe we go from revision 2 to revision 3. In some way, we can very quickly and easily determine that that form was in fact revised along with the basic narrative SOP itself. And then all of these documents, controlled documents, are expected to be subjected to some sort of periodical review. FDA expects that you will do some periodic review of all of these controlled documents in some period of time, every 2 or 3 years or so, not necessarily to change these documents, but to make this review to make sure that they still are current and compliant with the GMP requirements. So we must have a procedure for doing that. Again, it's probably another SOP that describes how we will conduct that periodic review and how we will document that periodic review. And then, of course, we always have to maintain documents in some kind of an original form. That is, if it's an original electronic form or a hard copy, we're always going to have archived copies of previous forms and procedures. Sometimes it's important to go back and look at archived copies to see just what was the procedure in place, say a year ago, or whenever a particular activity was done. And so we need to archive and have complete record of all documents that we have produced. And then need to be completed using good documentation practices. We're going to talk a little bit more about good documentation practices a bit later. So then we must make sure that we associate the forms with the appropriate SOP. As I mentioned earlier, those forms should be controlled along with the SOP itself. So again, if we change the procedure, the written procedure, there may well be a need to change the form. And again, we'll have unique identifiers on the procedure and the form, so we know if and when the changes were made. And again, that will be in the documentation section of the SOP, the revision documentation section of the SOP, to show what in fact we did, when we did it, and why we did it. And so surrounding all of this on the controlled documents and other activities in the facility, we're going to have something called change control procedure. Now, if you scour the drug and the dietary supplement GMPs, you will find very little or nothing on the topic of change control. But it's very clear once we get a compliant system in terms of qualified equipment and procedures, controlled documents, we cannot just willy-nilly be changing these things. So we have to establish a change control procedure that requires that we document and log when changes are requested, changes are properly reviewed and approved by the subject matter experts and again by the quality unit, and that we complete all of these changes in accordance with that procedure. So if a change is requested, someone requests the change, it's reviewed by the appropriate subject matter experts, and then before it's implemented, the quality group must review and approve that change. Then it can go ahead and implement that change. Okay. So when we're talking about change, we need to talk about the potential impact on existing equipment qualification, process validation. If we're going to put in a new mixer in a facility, for instance, we're going to have to qualify that new mixer. We're going to have to determine, is that new mixer going to have an impact on the process validation? Again, if it's a drug product, and we're going to have to make those evaluations. Putting a new mixer in may require that we do new process validation for that product or products that are involved, okay? And as I suggested, changes must be reviewed and approved by the appropriate department, subject matter experts, and finally, by the quality personnel themselves. Finally, keep in mind that time should be allocated before implementation of a change to allow for training of the impacted personnel. If we're making a significant change, like maybe putting in a new mixer, there are going to be new instructions for operating that mixer, maybe a variety of new work instructions, SOPs, or otherwise that will have to be implemented along with that. And we have to make sure that people are in fact trained on those new revised procedures before we implement that new change. So part of the auditing process should be looking at change control activities, okay? So there should be a list of changes, or at least a list of trends and changes. We select a few of the specific change control documents and review them. Make sure they've gone through the appropriate evaluation for impact, potential impact on existing equipment and process. Make sure we've done the assessment of the necessary control documents, whether documents are going to have to be changed as a result again of maybe putting in this new mixer. And again, as we pointed out already, it must be reviewed and approved by the quality unit, and there must be training done on these new revised procedures, or at a minimum, a decision made that the changes are so minimum that we don't have to retrain people on these particular procedures. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea of good documentation practices. And we're going to cover just a few examples of good documentation practices. But it's expected that document the activity at the time of performance, not or contemporaneously, as FDA calls it, not sometime later. Now, again, in my auditing activity, it's not uncommon. I'll go into a drug manufacturing area and I see that they're mixing product. They've put a lot of materials into the mixer. Maybe they've even mixed the batch and dumped it off into bulk holding containers. And I go to the batch record and there have been no entries at all made about the entry of each of these individual ingredients. And not uncommonly, I'll talk to the operator and say, why aren't these entries made? Well, we'll go back and we'll put them all in after we get everything added. No, that is not what the requirements are in all of the GMPs. When you weigh, dispense, and charge a particular ingredient into the mixer, you're expected to document at the time it's done, at the time of performance, that activity was in fact done, not sometime later. Not only do you document a person did it, but in the case of the drug and dietary supplement, we usually have two people there. We have the date and initials of the person who added that material to the mixer. We have the date and initials of the person that verified that it was properly added. So we don't do that sometime later. We do it at the time it was done, okay? So just a couple more bullet suggestions here. If we are post-dating or putting these documentations into the record after the activity's already been performed, FDA could make a case that we are falsifying the data in the records because we're relying on our memory of what was done rather than documenting at the time it was performed. And we see that term at the time performed reoccurring a number of times throughout the GMPs, both the drug and the dietary supplement, which tells us how important the FDA believes that this idea is. And certainly documentation must be permanent and legible. We don't use pencil or whiteout to change documentation. And it must indicate who performed the activity with the signature or initial or date of when it was done. It's very important to know who did certain activities, particularly if you get involved in doing some follow-up investigations. People that were there at the time, they are the ones that most likely will understand what happened. So if you had something unusual happen, you may be able to talk to the people that did the work and you can see what happened out here. Well, maybe they'll remember something that wasn't even documented in the records. So very important to know who did those things. So we talked about the idea that all entries must include the units of measure and so on. And that there is a proper way of correcting errors. And this slide provides an example of the proper way. The 193, can't quite read it, 0.7G, can't quite read it for sure what it is. So we simply cross it out, write in the right entry, make an initial and date of the person that did the entry correction, and a little bit of explanation of why it was changed. In this case, says it was a transcription error. This is the proper way to make corrections. Don't cross it out is the bottom example here. And you can kind of read it, the original, but not quite. No, there is a correct way, and this is the best correct way to do that. So whenever we're doing auditing, we're always aware of this idea of good documentation practices, and we're looking for that in any and all documents and records that we're reviewing. If we see any examples of that, we will probably note that in our audit observations. Particularly if we seem to see a trend of this, it probably indicates that there's a need to do some good documentation practice training in the facility to correct that. Now, there is some FDA guidance for industry on the idea of data integrity and compliance with GMPs, and here's just one reference that you might want to look at. as it's it's a good document, give you a general overview of what FDA considers to be data integrity issues and how to best do those activities. Now we're going to talk about just a little bit more about documentations, and my topic is suspicious documentation. Certainly, we're always looking for inconsistent dates where we see a date on one document says we did a certain activity. We look at another document where the same activity is referenced. The dates are not consistent. The next area, absence of exceptions or results that look too good. If I look at a number of documents and I never see anything but exactly 90.0% purity reported, that just looks too good. That isn't the way things happen in the real world. We do have some variation within the range of that specification when we're testing products. If we always see exactly 90.0 or 95.0, whatever it is, that should raise suspicions in your mind because that's just too good. It doesn't happen that way, in fact, in practice. And then you also, depending on your scientific knowledge of the area, there may be data points that are just not reasonable at all. You need to try to evaluate that. And, there's a whole area of outliers. Now, it's not inconceivable. We will have outliers in particular analytical tests, and there's a provision for dealing with that and trying to determine that it is an exceptional, not normal kind of evaluation that will probably come through our out-of-spec or out-of-trend evaluations. And there's ambiguatory wording. Think of a good example of it right at the moment, but you'll recognize this when you see it. Well, you're not being specific about our conclusions. We're not being specific about the basis for making our conclusions. All of our conclusions in these documents should be scientifically sound, and they should be backed up by data. Amy, do we want to take a little break for some bio break and maybe some questioning
Sure.
now, or you want to wait?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Do you want to take questions real quickly, or do you want to wait and come back in 10 minutes or so and take questions then?
Why don't we come back in about 10 minutes?
Okay.
And then we'll take questions, and then we'll go into this last section and finish this up for today.
Sounds great. Okay, so if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand in the participants tab, and we will see everyone back at about 12:40 Eastern. Is that a good?
That's what I got. 12:40.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bob, I don't see any questions so far.
No questions?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, we'll go through the last section and then offer one more chance.
Sure, absolutely. I will go ahead and mute my mic. That will allow you to take control of the screen again, and then you just get started as soon as you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to mute now.
They don't seem to be moving here. What's happening? Hey, Mary there? Okay, I think probably everybody's back and we'll get started again. I understand from Amy that as of now, we did not have any questions. So we'll move on through this last segment then for today and have one more option for questions after I finish this. So we'll go on into this final section then on auditing personnel, training, and hygiene. Certainly, it's a cliche, but we all know that hiring good people and developing them is certainly an important part of operating your business. And certainly that people are one of the most important resources that you have in your operation. And the next bullet, employee error account for a large percentage of product defects in GMP non-compliance. As I suggested earlier in the presentation, in our auditing experience, very often we find mistakes were made. But I do not believe that people intentionally make mistakes. But when we dig down into what caused these mistakes, it's not uncommon that people just were not trained on a procedure. If they were not trained on a procedure, they're going to read the procedure and they're going to make their best judgment about how to conduct the activity. But you may make one decision about how to do it, and I make another decision about how to do it, and it turns out that it wasn't done as intended or wasn't done correctly. So certainly employee training is a very essential part of making sure that the performance is done under the proper controls, and in fact, the procedure is in fact followed as written. So under both the drug and the dietary supplement GMPs, there are discussion about quality personnel, and it clearly says that the company must have assigned quality personnel to oversee and manage the quality program in their facility. Now, when we look at a little deeper, is a description or a definition of quality unit personnel. These are pretty similar between the two regulations. Almost any GMP you look at is going to have some definition similar to this. Basically, it says any person, persons, or group within or outside your organization who the company designates to be responsible for quality operations. So we are going to have a written procedure that defines the responsibilities and duties of the quality unit. And we're also going to identify who those people are. As this slide suggests, it could be inside or outside your organization. You may have some quality activities conducted for you under contract, and those people would be subject to your oversight and a review and approval. But at any rate, we're going to have such a procedure that identifies what the responsibilities and duties are, and who are assigned to those. So we're going to start by having job descriptions. We're going to assign and identify in those job descriptions what are the requirements for quality operators in terms of education, training, and experience. So we start with the job description, and it says exactly what kind of education, training, and experience a person must have to be a quality technician or a quality department manager, whatever the position is. We determine the requirements through the job descriptions. And then the last bullet, talking about having quality responsibilities distinct and separate from other responsibilities. As I pointed out early in this discussion today, we always look at the organizational chart because we're looking to make certain that all of the quality staff have a direct reporting line to top management, that they do not report to production people, production manager. Because if that is the case, as I suggested, we immediately have a conflict of interest. If a quality personnel's boss is the production manager, that cannot be permitted and it's not going to work well. Whoops, excuse me. Had a little glitch in my slide advancement. I got it now. So FDA has used the term quality unit, particularly under the dietary supplement GMPs. But there is no specific definition of a quality assurance or quality control, but rather they group all of the people that are assigned quality duties into this terminology of quality unit. So we usually look at the quality unit collectively as both the quality assurance and quality control. Now, in the drug industry, maybe more than the dietary supplement industry, there tends to be a quality assurance group, which is mostly usually oversight activities, and then the quality control group that typically might be just the laboratory operations. But however you organize and structure your operation is not specifically dictated by these regulations, but you decide how that's best going to operate for you. So it allows flexibility on your management part then to assign responsibilities for various activities, whether it's in the quality affairs or quality control. Everything probably then is within a quality unit, and you decide who's going to be responsible for certain things. Just remember that some of the basic tenets that are in all these regulations is the idea that any and all release of product must be done by the quality unit. Any and all final review and approval of documentation and changes of documentation must be done by somebody in the quality unit. At a minimum, it's somebody in the quality unit that has a quality title. So when I'm reviewing documents for final approval or release of product, I'm always looking to see that person that did that final release or approval, in fact, is assigned to the quality unit. So then when we start talking about training documentation, we're going to have a written procedure again that's going to describe exactly how training is to be managed and conducted. And some basic tenets, and in fact, the bottom set of bullets pretty much come from the dietary supplement GMPs. It says that the documentation must include the date of the training, type of training, training content or reference thereof, the persons that were trained, and the trainer. So that, again, comes specifically from the dietary supplement GMPs, but we suggest for any and all training documentation, this should basically be the test we're looking for as to the types of documentation we have for training. So we start with a job description for this person that we're going to train. And everybody should have a job description. Again, it describes the education, training, and experience, but also the responsibilities of that particular position. So we can determine from that the job functions that are required so that we can begin to design our training program for a specific person occupying a particular job description. Then, of course, there's a lot of on-the-job training as well. When you're looking at an operator out in the factory, there's a considerable amount of need to have hands-on, one-on-one, if you will, with a trainer that is a trained operator to explain those kind of activities as well. Now, those are certainly important activities to be done so the operator understands how to turn the equipment on, how to operate the equipment, and so on. So we're going to have that on-the-job training, company policies and procedures. And of course, everybody in the facility that's responsible for GMP compliance needs to have training on whatever the GMP is that you're required to follow. Again, if it's a drug company, you need to train everybody on the drug GMPs, 21 CFR Part 211. Likewise, if it's dietary supplement, it's 21 CFR Part 111. Again, for different industries, device or otherwise, you got to make sure that all operators that are involved in GMP compliance have been trained on that document. And then, of course, SOP training. We've touched on that a bit already. When we write SOPs, we want to make sure that people are in fact trained on how to fulfill the requirements of a given SOP. Other training on equipment and instrumentation, manufacturing processes. A lot of this will be on the job with a trainer, but there will be written procedures as well that describe how to set up a piece of equipment, how to clean a piece of equipment, and so on and so forth. In the laboratory area, of course, we have a lot of specific tests, a lot of specific test methods. So we'll have to make sure that people are required to conduct a particular test, such as an HPLC test, for instance, that they in fact have been trained on that specific test method that they must use. SOP training, again, we've emphasized that repeatedly, and I don't think I can overemphasize it. But each activity or operation performed in a GM facility must be governed by an SOP. And you've heard that so much already that you are probably getting tired of hearing it. But it's a very basic tenet of compliance with the GMP requirements that we have these written procedures, and that in fact we have trained people on how to fulfill the requirements of that SOP. So the next bullet is important to remember that SOP training must be completed before performance of any activity and so on under that SOP and after any revision. So there and again, I pointed out earlier the idea that when we change an SOP or when we put it in place for the first time, we cannot make it effective unless and until we have documented that everybody that has to use that SOP, in fact, has been trained on that SOP. Now, there are a variety of ways of how we might train people on SOPs. Sometimes, if it's just a minor revision on an SOP, we might just approach it through a read and understand. That is, people can just read the procedure, maybe fulfill a few little questions or quiz, and that's sufficient. However, if we made major changes or it's a brand new SOP, then we're probably going to have on-site training with a supervisor or at least a subject matter expert who understands or maybe even wrote the procedure. And then finally, the idea of proficiency tests. FDA doesn't necessarily require that you do a comprehension test after the training, but we think it's a good idea to have a few little question testing done after training just to make sure people are certainly understanding the requirements of a procedure. Training plans just have to be in place, okay? So we must develop and implement all personnel. Again, we start with the idea of looking at their job description, and we develop a training matrix based on that job description. We look at that job description and we determine what are the duties and responsibilities of that job description. And from that, we make a training matrix or training plan, if you will, that identifies all these duties and responsibilities. And then we actually conduct the identified training. So then we have an easy document for auditing and an easy document for demonstrating that that person is appropriately trained to operate under that job description. So we're going to have training then for all SOPs. We're going to have some on-the-job training. Sometimes you'll have external training. We in EAS often go into companies and we give them general GMP training. We're not really equipped to train them on their own SOPs, but you can approach it in a variety of ways. And then finally, we should have some idea of refresher training or requalifying frequencies. Not necessarily all companies have a plan of qualifying operators on a particular procedure, but some do. And if they're qualified or certified, there may be a need to occasionally redo that certification, or even some refresher training, which is often can be done for instance, you have a deviation or an out of specification issue. And as you resolve that issue, you may determine that it'd probably be a good idea to retrain people on the deviation procedure or the OS procedure. So they're just in their routine course of business, there are opportunities for doing some retraining. Okay, so when we look at auditing training plans then, we're going to look at training records and folders and files, but I always want to look at an individual training file, and I like to see, in fact, I suggest you really need to see in that individual training file for John or Joe or whoever it might be, that training matrix, a training plan. What is that person required to do? And what skills and activities were identified to perform the operations identified in that procedure. And then we're going to examine records and documentation to see that in fact that training was accomplished. And then the job description identifies education, experience, and training necessary for that job, that in fact this person is shown to have the appropriate education and experience. And the training, again, we will identify that through the training matrix or the training plan and the documentation that in fact those identified things were in fact documented in a training form of some way. Now, just a little bit on the idea of personnel hygiene. And again, I think I mentioned that idea a little bit in the opening presentations. Hygienic practices, of course, are always important for both drugs and dietary supplements. But again, depending on the nature of your product, is it subject to microbiological contamination or is it not? And some products just, in fact, will not support growth at all. So the requirements in this area will vary, again, depending on the nature of your product. So you're going to have to know a good bit about the nature of your product to determine just what kind of things we need to address to them. However, in both the GMPs, the drug and device, there are some specific discussions about what you need to do to notify your operators. That is, if people come in sick or if they have any of these issues identified on this slide, their illness, infections, open lesion, so on and so forth, where they could possibly be a source of contamination for the product, particularly if they're working around exposed product. They need to notify their supervisors of that condition, and the supervision and management have to decide, are they suitable to operate today with that health condition, or do they have to be excluded, or do they maybe possibly have to be assigned temporarily to a different job? For instance, if an operator come in and they had some kind of a open sores or wounds, and they were operating around exposed, unprotected product, it probably wouldn't be suitable for that job today. Maybe we could reassign them to activities maybe out in the warehouse where they're picking and loading product for shipment that is protected in packages and in containers and boxes, such that there wouldn't be much likelihood of contaminating the product. If that's the case, we might be able to reassign them temporarily until they get better. So there's some of the ideas we think about, in terms of what we might need to do, what we could do, so we don't have to necessarily just send that person home. First bullet here kind of discusses that idea that depending on the nature of the product, where they're working, we may be able to relocate that person for a short period of time until they get better, and then we can bring them back into what they ordinarily do. Now, this slide talks about the nature of the tobacco product, but we really could put in any product, drug, device, dietary supplement, or otherwise. What is the susceptibility of that product to microgrowth? And that's the point that I've made early on. It determines just what kind of hygienic practices we might need to have. But there are some basic hygienic practices that we're always going to want to follow. And for sure, as we've been fighting through this COVID situation, we've learned about washing your hands. Wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. How many times have we heard that over the last several weeks, particularly in relation to COVID? But it's always been a practice that should be implemented whenever we're working around products, particularly products that are going to be ingested by people. We need to wash our hands, we need to sanitize, we need to do whatever we can to prevent the people from becoming a source of contamination. So the basic idea of any and all hygienic practices is that people are certainly one of the dirtiest things that come around our products. So we have to address cleanliness and hygienic practices for people by whatever means that might be. So washing hands, sanitizing surfaces, wearing gloves, gowns, whatever is appropriate. And then beyond that, what do we do with their personal belongings? We don't want to have food and gum and drink and any tobacco products in a manufacturing area for drugs or dietary supplements. And you must have company practices and procedures that make it clear to people that we cannot permit that within any manufacturing areas. And personal cleanliness, washing, cleaning, basic sanitation practices, as well as washing our hands and otherwise. But then we talking about microbial contamination. But then there are other extraneous things too. We need to talk about filth, hair, cosmetic, tobacco products. So we are going to wear hair nets. We're going to wear gowns. Probably we're going to wear gloves. Everything we can do to help prevent contaminating these products, other than micro materials, any things that might just fall into the product. For instance, if we have exposed product going on a packaging line, we expect that those lines where there's exposed products will be covered with shields, protective coverings. So things could not fall down from above the product and contaminate the product as it rolls down the line into the final packaging. So when we're doing our auditing, we're going to observe some of these hygienic practices, again, by the tour, the facility tour we talked about. We're going to inspect bathroom facilities. When we go through a factory, I always go into some of the bathrooms to see that they appear to be clean, that they do have hot and cold running water. The towels are clean, floors are clean, toilets are flushed and clean, but there isn't any potential source of contamination from the bathrooms themselves. And then we're going to talk about and evaluate the gowning practices. Not necessarily all operations have to be done with gowned people. If you're working out in the warehouse where the product is in packages and cases and protected, probably gowning is not necessarily a requirement. But if you're working in the manufacturing area where product and materials are exposed, it certainly is general practice for people to wear gowns to protect the best we can. And how about people be going to meal breaks or to coffee breaks or to the bathroom? When they go to the bathroom, do they leave their dirty gloves back? Do they come back and put on those dirty gloves? Just general observations that you can make as you're just making those observations during your tour. Okay, Amy?
Looks like we're at the end of our slideshow.
Yeah, we're already at the end of the
And-
slide, so I knew
Yeah,
that was
great. So let's take a look. I don't see any raised hands. Does anyone have any questions? I see one. Magna, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask your question. Great, I see you're unmuted, so go ahead. Hello? Magna, we can't hear you. If you have a question, perhaps speak up or. Huh. How about, Magna, how about you email your question to me and we can address it first thing on Wednesday? Would that work? I don't know why we're not able to hear you. I see you're muted again, but so if you want to try to unmute one more time.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now we can, great. Perfect.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question in regards to cosmetics. In terms of like hygienic manufacture and restroom placements, is there any guideline on segregation of manufacturing facility and restroom facility, or is it okay for it to be on the same floor, or there need to be dividers? Like, what is the current standard, and what is the industry standard on it as well?
So did I understand you're talking about cosmetics?
Yes, cosmetics.
Okay. Okay, well, for starters, FDA does not have any GMPs in place for manufacturing of cosmetics. There are some voluntary industry standards out there that read very similar to the drug or even dietary supplement GMPs. But since there are no specific GMPs for cosmetics, there is nothing FDA could enforce. So having said that, you need to be familiar with the voluntary standards for cosmetic GMPs. And if you're not, let us know and we can provide them to you. But that's all we have. So, however, if you read those regulations, those voluntary standards, I think you'll find they read very similar to the drug or dietary supplement. So I would suggest the same kind of general ideas and practices about spatial separation of materials and making sure that you have physical barriers if you can, things like that. But the bottom line, there's no regulatory requirement for that.
Got it.
Hello?
Thank you. Yep. Thank you for the response. I do have one more question. As a reseller of products, what sort of when you are doing an internal mock audit as a reseller of products, what are some key things that you should look out for?
Well, in your internal audit program, as I suggested, first of all, you're going to have an SOP that describes how you're going to manage that program. But I think the most critical thing is to develop a detailed, meaningful audit plan and identify what you are going to be looking for in your internal audit activity. And to me, the main thing we're looking for in internal auditing is two things, really. First of all, do we have an adequate quality system in place? Although that should have been top management responsibility right away. So assuming we have an adequate quality program in place, our internal auditing is mainly just to verify that in fact, our quality system in fact is being followed by operators out in the facility, whether it be in batch production or be in product testing, whatever it might be. We need to identify the standards we've established and make sure that we are following our own established standards. To me, that's the main part of the internal auditing, is determining you're following the quality program you've established as a company.
Got it. But even as a reseller, like we don't manufacture products, but we get products from other contract manufacturers. It's about what SOPs do we have and whether we are adhering to those SOPs as well.
So you're having your products contract manufactured?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I would say the same thing for cosmetics as is required by drugs and dietary supplements. If you have products contract manufactured for you and you sell them under your label, you are responsible to verify that that contract manufacturer has produced them in accordance with whatever quality standard exists. And again, I have to, reiterate that in the cosmetic area, you don't have a required GMP, but there are industry voluntary GMPs that most cosmetic companies are going to expect their contractors to follow. So up front, you need to qualify that contract manufacturer by evaluating their quality program. And then that's probably done by an on-site audit to verify the program is in fact compliant. In fact, we in EAS do that often for drug and dietary supplement companies. Then once you have qualified that person or that company, when products are received, you may have certain incoming evaluation, maybe even some testing of incoming products to verify that they in fact are what they say they are, that they're pure and compliant. Your area of cosmetics, you're luckier than the drug and dietary supplement people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions out there? I don't see anything. So it is about 1:15. I will say thank you all for joining us. I apologize, I've got some background airline noise coming in. Thank you all for joining us today. We will see you Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern using the link for the Wednesday training. If you do think of any questions in the meantime, you're welcome to email them to me. We can start with those before we start our next session. And thank you. Have a great rest of the day and a great Tuesday.
Thank you all for attending.
Bye.